This second handout number 2, we're going to talk a bit about more of the written title, which is by way of the deeds, preparation of one of the common way of registering or owning property is by way of deeds, the preparation of a deed. Typically, it's a warranty deed that is prepared. A general definition of what is deed. A deed is a written document transferring ownership of land from one party, usually a grantor, to another party, which is a grantee, and is evidence of title. So it's basic evidence of title. Now, I just want to remind you from the last handout that we talked about. Unwritten title takes priority over the written documents. So, but yeah, nowadays this is what we are referring to. And if someone in the future comes in and says they have unwritten title and can have evidence of it, that means they would certainly have priority, and obviously it's going to go to court. Title is a legal basis or grounds for land ownership. It may be transferred by inheritance by way of a will, or commonly done by purchasing from a grantor, or another way that we talked about earlier on, adverse possession, and lastly, it can be obtained by condemnation. A deed contains, as a minimum, a grantor, so your deed should have mentioned who is the grantor and the grantee, a date when it becomes effective, and the duration of transfer. Written description must include to avoid ambiguity. 1. Define a common intent. What's the intent between the grantor and the grantee? Then secondly, define the size, the shape, the area, the location in terms of its coordinates and its position and its perimeter and the size of it, in order to define it accurately, and for future retracement determine whether or not to help in identifying where those boundaries, the original boundaries, were placed. Third, in the description, be easy to define and mark by putting monuments out there, identifying the corners of the boundaries, and being able to identify the property boundaries in order to compute the area and the perimeter. 4. Allow comparison to adjoiners description. Be able to identify or show in relation to the neighboring parcels, which we refer to them as adjoiners, their description. And 5, the written description should provide for future relocation in terms of identifying where those original boundaries were located. A good description will be accurate, brief, clear, and complete. Do not want to create confusion, avoid ambiguity, avoid misinterpretation, and the only way to do that is by way of making it clear, complete, and accurate, and as brief as possible. Some types of description include, these are different types of description. Your meets and bounds. It can be meets, or it can be bounds, or it can be usually a mixture of the two of them, which we spoke about in the earlier chapters of the textbook. Another type of description is the U.S. Public Land System, USPLS. We covered a large majority of that in the textbook. Third type of description is your plating, your subdivisions, where we have where we talked about simultaneous ownership. So those subdivisions, all of those plots, all of those tracts of land of equal level of importance. Another type of description is your word description, referencing to maps, natural objects, and also referencing your joiners. And lastly, the fifth type of description is by way of coordinates. And of course, those coordinates would be with reference to a particular projection system and datum, and the type of horizontal and vertical datum. Let's go into a bit more detail into the different types of description. For meets and bounds description, the phrase meets and bounds has no specific meaning, only generally, and may not necessarily be measured distances and angles. May not necessarily be that. All such descriptions must have a point of beginning. So there is a point of beginning where the service started, which should be permanent. So permanent location on the ground must be permanent, well-defined reference, and preferably located near the parcel being described. So you want to get a point of beginning close to where the parcel is being described. Usually, meets and bounds have a reference call to other surveys, so are tied to other surveys, such as the original USPLS, the section corners, reference to or statement of an object. So you want to draw reference to this object or a course, meaning a direction, a distance, or other element in the description. The better you can tie down those boundaries representing the property boundaries in your description, it's easier for retracing surveyors to come back and find where the original monuments were placed. This type of description, the meets and bound description, is distinguished by a perimeter description, each course describing a sequence as one travel around the entire area described. So you want to, when you're doing the meets and bounds, you start from one side and you go around the entire perimeter of the property, and then when you close off where you start up on the same point you start up, you want to close off at the same point you started up, and that way you can calculate the area for the tract of land. In a meets and bound description from a parent tract, the line of conveyance is that which is described regardless of the contrary intent. So in terms of the areas that being surveyed, that line of subdivision that's cut out from a parent tract is described in the description. It's actually implied the original intent of the grantor and the grantee, except in cases of senior rights or defective descriptions. Defective description, we're talking about descriptions that does not convey, has a lot of ambiguity, and is not accurately describing what is out there in the real world. Bounds. Under your meets and bound description, what are bounds? Basically, it's the calls in terms of calls an element of a deed. For joiners, for example, bounds can be an object. Bounds, for an example of an object, could be a mound of rocks, or it can be the bounds based upon the measurements. An object, another object could be the river, a river bounded by a river by its name. Also, it can be the bounds can be defined by their joiners, the type of exclusion, the roads, the streams, or the monuments. Meets description can be in the form of a distance and a direction only. It's called meets and bounds. On some of the old deeds would consist of a combination of meets and bounds. It is desirable to define corners, an example, your iron pin or your fence post, define with distances and direction all courses, not thence to your point you're beginning. In addition, names of adjoining owners and the total area should be included, because all of these are characteristics for retracing surveyors to look for those evidence and identify those evidence in terms of the priority of calls, where the judge or the jury will determine the weights for all of these. The word description may refer to a map versus an old well-known map, or may use roads and streams or bays as beginning point. It can also call for trees and rocks, etc. So in your word description can be very detailed in terms of the words that they use and how detailed they are describing the boundaries as they would define the entire tract of land. Coordinates are a legal method of describing land. However, they should be referenced to a well-known and readily available datum. You can have coordinates, but the datum can be coordinates of a particular of boundaries that are referenced to different datums. And for retracing surveyors, in order for them to retrace the original boundary, they have to be using the datum used at the time of setting out the original boundaries. State plane coordinates may be combined with metes and bounds. Description should note explicitly which zone and which state in the description. Strip conveyances is another description typically used for right-of-ways or easements. We talked about that earlier in the textbook. They're typically described as laying X feet on either side of a line. So this sort of verbiage is included in the description. The line is described in route surveying terms. For example, in your strip conveyances, you're going to have the word stationing. That is a common word used in route surveying, or it may be over the northerly 100 feet, etc. Another way of putting in descriptions for strip conveyances. Road discrepancies are usually in the form of route surveying terms and described as, for example, strip of land along and on each side of the line described as follows. And the following slide will give you an example. Many descriptions have several different types involved. Example, begin at the northwest corner of the northeast quarter section 12 Township 16 south, range 5 west, then south along the west line of the said section, a distance of 661.43 feet, more or less, even though they give it to 2 decimal places, etc. So this is, in this example description, it combines all of the different ways of, well, a large majority of the different ways of describing boundaries, combination of them. Here you see the USPLS description of the range and townships, and here we see a distance that's so accurately determined, etc. Another type is, for example, east 50 feet of lot 12 block 6. This means that this east boundary of the conveyance is the east line of a lot 12 right away. If the east and west or the north and south lines are not parallel or in the cardinal direction, and that is north-south or east-west, then the dividing line should be in the cardinal direction bisecting the parcel. And this different interpretation introduces ambiguity and causes confusion in the retracement of any of surveys. Use record directions where available, so you want to make sure to use what's on record in order to do retracement. When the description calls from east to west, north, etc., half the boundaries are nearly in a cardinal direction, then the dividing line should be made parallel to existing boundary. And there are different scenarios upon which the interpretation of description can be different. Principle may be used for regularly shaped lots not oriented with cardinal directions. In descriptions involving acreage conveyance, some rules usually apply, which we talked about in the textbook. Parcels should be parallelogram if possible. Where the line can be determined, the ambiguity will be construed against the grantor. So if there are some ambiguity, it will be against the grantor. If more than one lot or part is being conveyed, then the deed should state the whole lot first, then the fractions of it. So you want to divide up from the entire extent into this more detailed subdivision, or the fractions of the tracts of land. Do not use double calls when writing descriptions. Determine the intent, then use wording to convey the same. Using double calls, again, you will be introducing ambiguities. The intent between the grantor and grantee must be explicit. Use form of a reminder so discrepancies can be resolved easily. That is, lot 1, for example, lot 1 except west 50 feet, where west 50 feet has already been conveyed. So if west 50 feet has already been conveyed, that is stationary and is consistent, and you want to build upon that. Avoid overlaps. If gap occurs, the original owner, if there in the retracement gaps existed, then the owners of those gaps will be the original title owner, the grantor. In meets and bounds description of parcels adjoining a public or private road, ownership is to the center of the road unless specifically stated otherwise. So if it's not stated in the description, then the ownership in a meets and bound description is towards the center line of the road. An easement gives the right to use land for a specific purpose. An easement necessary for the enjoyment of a land automating passes with fee simple stated or not. In a description, you need to also put in easements, and easements would typically also have a description. If the word easement is left out, fee simple may be conveyed. If it can be shown that someone is using a property and for access and did not specify that the access was a form of easement, then it can be interpreted in legal terms that fee simple title is conveyed. Use should be stated, that is for road and utility purposes. An easement attached to a property passes with the title to the land. So if you have an existing easement on a property, that easement passes along with the title of that land. For if we do have another grantee, a line may be described by length. Property boundaries is defined by the length, the bearing, the endpoints, and a combination of them. Bearings are usually used to describe directions in boundary surveying. However, they may be bearings can be with respect to azimuths, or it can be with respect to angles or coordinates. Deflection angles are not commonly used, but long ago not commonly used in Alabama, but other states that they would have used in certain circumstances. Deflection angles, which we talked about in previous chapters in the textbook. Azimuths are usually measured from north in land surveying, usually used in the state plane coordinate system descriptions. SPC means state plane coordinates. Coordinates can be used in the description. State plane coordinates include Lambert transverse Makita projections. For example, 158 miles max width, central meridian, sea level distance, scale, etc. We discussed all of these in previous classes, and all of this need to be, if you're using coordinates, just put in all of that in the description. Curves in the description must give if you're describing a curve, you must give the radius of the curve. From the radius, you can determine the circumference and the area of the circle, and also you can also use the curves in order to determine the angle of intersection, the length of the curve. Curves also the description, you want to add at least a minimum of 2 elements and the direction of the curvature, for example to a point, thence run southeasterly along a curve to the left, having a radius of whatever value is the radius in feet, a distance of whatever value in feet to a point, or concave to the east, etc. When describing curves, even degree of curve need to be included. In some instances, even the tangent to that curve and the radius also need to. The more information you give, the better it is will be for the retracing surveyor to get to the original boundaries. Should be used when possible. In subdivision conveyances, avoid using double description. So you don't want to have two descriptions for one tract of land. Which one is correct? That is lot and block with meets and bounds, as this may lead to problems of proration or senior right. If there are inconsistencies between the descriptions of this one tract of land, multiple description, then judge will revert back to senior right. Except the street, along the sideline of the street, etc., are terms of exclusion. Almost any other type of call will mean along the center of the street. So a description like except the street means that you are excluding the street. Or if in the description you put along the sideline of the street, then the boundary is along the sideline of the street. If not, if none of these are included, then the normal assumption is it's along the center of the street. Descriptions not including highway, but rather an easement will not pass feet toward a road. Including that a highway meaning an access to a property for in order to get access to landlocked areas. Those easements will not pass the fee simple in terms of putting an actual road there. If deeds do not exactly define reversions we talked about in previous chapters. If an easement becomes nullified and you want to revert back to the original boundaries, then land is divided equitable among the adjoiners, and there are various rules apply in terms of proportionate measurement, and also these rules apply to roads and railroads, etc. A deed is never proof of ownership. Others may have rights such as taxes, liens, mortgages, easements, judgments, assessments, zoning, etc. So a deed gives you title to the land, but it's not total ownership to the land. Someone else who do have an unwritten document, unwritten title, can have, well, certainly do have more rights than someone who has a deed. In a warranty deed, the grantor personally guarantees title to be free of defects, debt, or the bankruptcy, leaves grantee without insurance. So that's why when you buy a property, you want to take out title insurance. Patents, that's the original grants given to first settlers in America, do not guarantee title. It is really a quitclaim deed. So a patent, the original patent given out to first settlers that came to America, is referred to as quitclaim deed. Patents are typically issued with the following conditions. 1, must be executed in accordance with the existing laws at the time that the patent was issued. 2, must be correct description given the circumstances at the time the patent was issued. And 3, must not have prior patent issued. So you can't have a patent upon a patent. Alright, there's only one patent executed by the then government. Sequence conveyances. Describing sequence conveyances. Most sequence conveyances, we talked about that in previous classes as well, are your meets and bounds types and are used exclusively outside the areas of the USPNS. When meets and bound descriptions are used, these principles control senior rights, description of the independent of others. 3, should describe monuments. 4, may have to rely on possession lines. And this is the hierarchy upon which you're looking for evidence. Priority, senior rights is on top of the list. In general, these rules are observed in all states in regard to metes and bounds descriptions. Laws vary from state to state. Requires prorated measurement. The U.S. requires prorated measurements. Written deeds must be used to transfer land, with some exceptions. If a description is applicable to either of the two properties, then it is void. When considering a deeds term, do not omit or insert anything, or when you rewrite it, use the original wording if possible. A call for a plat makes the plat an integral part. So if you mention a plat in the description, the plat needs to be with the description. Informative terms indeed yields the controlling terms. Example, 300 feet to a concrete monument. So this 300 feet is informative term. It leads to a more controlling term, which is your concrete monument, which is what you should see on the ground. A call for joiners implies a senior right. So if you mention the joiners in the description, there is implication of a senior right. Not always true title search necessary to be the user. Alright, so this is not necessary. The existing user of that property might not be the true title holder. Written intentions, except for adverse possession or senior right, written intentions will govern title transfers unless a disinterested third party will be adversely affected, or it can be shown that the exact interpretation of the deed will defeat the intention. So the intentions need to be explicit in the writing of those, in the writing of the descriptions. Terms in a deed given the general accepted meaning at, for example, at the time of execution. The terms used at the time the deed was prepared must be understood in order to do an effective retracement. In general, description of land is that which is the least doubt. So you want to write descriptions where the least amount of doubt or ambiguities will be introduced. The written intention must be well defined and relocatable. In general, ambiguities in a deed will be the responsibility or will be against the grantor. Particular intent will control over general intent, usually because particular intent is more focused as opposed to your general intent. Unless proven otherwise, unless proven contrary. Example, description conflict with a description conflict with caption would be included in the deed. A particular call is a special located description. A general call is more descriptive or directory. A particular call is more specific as opposed to a general call. Some few words about the public land surveys. The U.S. gained large tracts of land through purchase, the treaty and during the wartime period. Systems devised an ordinary transfer of land to private citizens by the public land surveys. Land laid out in sections 1 mile square, which we talked about in previous chapters. 8 corners were placed, 1 of each corner and 1 in the midpoint. Call your quarter corner if it's along the true line, not along the random line. Land may be described in any one or combination of these methods, that is, all of the section 17 line westerly of the U.S. highway, etc., as an example. It is necessary to know the history and the methods used to survey these types of land, the USPLS. In order to do that, you need to write effective description that is in line with the USPLS. Subdivision and survey plat. A plat is a surveyor's diagram showing boundaries of land and or subdivision of land with interrelationship of parcels of land. A map is a graphical representation of an area showing physical features to a particular scale, and of course with reference to a particular coordinate system if you're using coordinates. Some may show general land boundaries. Examples of subdivision can also show some political land boundaries, or some typically would obviously cover or contain the subdivision tracts. A subdivision is when an unapproved tract of land surveyed and divided into lots for sale purposes. So it's synonymous, similar meaning with the land development. Usually block lots regulated by state laws. There are regulations stipulating the size of these tracts and the designs of the roads and drainage network, etc. An example, Lot 1, Block 49, City View Park, City of Birmingham, Alabama. Plats are recorded in the county probate judge office. Subdivisions are regulated and must be approved by several agencies before it can be accepted and recorded in probate by the probate judge. So a lot of approval needed by the engineers, the Department of Health, and many other agencies need to look at subdivisions and check it thoroughly before subdivisions are recorded by the probate judge. The subdivision of land allows easy description of land and establishment of title to lots. Laws regulating subdivisions are passed by legislative bodies. Those regulations are what are used to define the specifications for subdivisions. The rules typically include the land use, the street improvement, zoning, and lot size and shapes and monumentations, accuracies, etc. Very detailed information in the subdivision regulations. Some laws require lot and blocks transfer. Some laws require title guarantee performance bonds, and there are many other various requirements depending upon the jurisdiction. Most regulations prohibit sale of lots prior to recording, so you cannot sell those lots until they are recorded in the probate judge's office. That is to protect, for the main reason, to protect the public. The agencies that must approve the subdivision typically, and I've listed out 4 of them, agencies that typically approve subdivisions: the Planning Board, Department of Health, they're looking at water and sewer systems, the city or county engineer, and also the governing body that decides upon the subdivision. Planning Board must approve preliminary layout, including street alignment, lot sizes, setback lines, and many other regulations. Also responsible for the final approval, the Planning Board. Easements must be dedicated, that is by some phrase or note on the plat, and must be binding on buyers of the lot. So that upfront, the buyers of the lots must know that they are in the existing easement. Dedication requires an offer and acceptance. In a subdivision, the developer would have to develop the roads to the level of acceptance by the city regulations, and when they are done with the development of the road, then they have to give it to the city in order for the city to maintain it at no cost. That process is called dedication. If accessible public water and sewer must be involved, that should also be included. Your public water distribution systems and sewer networks need to be also included in subdivisions and get the necessary approval. If water is available, provisions should be included. Sanitary sewer should be gravity flow. So the sanitary sewer, you try to use force of gravity to pull the fecal matter, to pull all of the sewer fluid sewage that goes through the sewer system.
by way of gravity. If not, then you're going to have a pumping system included. If no sewage system is available, then percolation tests must be performed by a licensed land surveyor and engineers for the developer, in order to make sure that the existing subsurface areas have the ability to filter out impurities in the water, because if there are no sewer system, then it's very likely that they have to have their own localized sewer system built within the subdivision. Application must be filed by a professional engineer or licensed land surveyor to the county health department. Various types of subdivision planning. There are four general types in land development. You have residential, commercial, residential being those individual houses owned by private owners, commercial for commercial use, industrial, large industrial areas, and then we have the fourth type is your recreational subdivision. For example, you have a community center that has a pool, etc. Our discussion will be limited to residential. Neighborhood plans may have its own shopping centers, churches, parks, etc. Most subdivisions are additions to previous development, or subdivision would add on to existing subdivisions. General plans of the street should be of similar size of existing roads. Location and name consistent with the nearby areas must conform to applicable laws as well, and all of this is identifying the regulations. Some elements involved in the development, example, your topography, you need to be aware of try to put in your subdivision that complements existing topography. Need to be aware of the rainfall for a subdivision so that you can design drains to accommodate for any extreme rainfall, so that the drainage network can accommodate for those storm waters, maximum minimum temperatures, etc. A topographic map is essential for good planning. It is used for drainage design, sewage and street locations. Street grades need to be 0.3%, 8%. Steeper grades may be allowed in temperate climates. Topographic maps should conform to the shapes of the ground as well as the elevations. No drastic changes in elevations as well, because if you do change up the natural terrain, it's going to be affecting other areas later on. Drainage consideration include grades, areas in watershed, ground cover, and climate. Also, all of these are factors that influence the drainage. Rolling hills or gentle sloping land is most economical to develop, so flat or gently sloping is cheapest of all to develop rather than the hilly areas. Steep slope requires steep sidewalk steps and excessive grading with provisions for erosion prevention. That's additional cost. Flat lands generally involve excessive cost for drainage provisions. Lots usually drain into streets which act as collectors. Lots with transverse slope is usually less desirable than back to front or vice versa. So the orientation of the lots with respect to the orientation of the houses will also influence its marketability or sale of that property. Grading is important. Control erosion by limit on the grades and by draining all the lots away from the building sites. Most drainage calculations should be based on a 50-year flood. And you want to avoid having water run directly into the streets, because that's going to cause hydroplaning in rainy conditions. Water lines should loop around, or should loop rather than stop at a dead end, and should be below the frost line, because you don't want to have damaged drainage water distribution systems. The trend in current subdivision development is toward the underground power and telephone lines. The general trend is that they put in most of these power lines and telecommunication are underground, where overhead lines are used in the line. The overhead lines are used. The lines should stay in the easement or the right of way. If overhead lines are used, then it should be within the right of way of the city or the road. When easements are used, they should be 8 to 10 feet wide unless specific circumstances are required. If power lines deflect 10 or more, easements for guy anchors should be provided, usually between 25 and 4 feet. Alright, this concludes our second handout. Please review it. It's a sort of a collection of what we have done in previous chapters, but also added more info in terms of subdivisions. Review the material and consider it as exam material for final exam.